Some goodbyes don't come with slammed doors or raised voices. Some happen quietly, across years, across holidays, across birthdays. My 70th came with no candles, no calls, just a message. No celebration this year. I smiled, said nothing, until I saw him in Paris, with his mother-in-law. And that's when I knew. He didn't forget me. He just replaced me. I'm Carolyn Westbrook, and this is the story of how I left the table before they stopped setting me a place. I woke up to the sound of the garbage truck outside and the low hum of the city just beginning to stir. It was my 70th birthday, though you wouldn't know it by looking around my small one-bedroom apartment in Minneapolis. No balloons, no flowers, no phone calls. Just the faint smell of yesterday's coffee lingering in the kitchen and the ache in my knees that never really went away these days. I sat up slowly, careful not to aggravate my hip, and reached for my phone on the nightstand. Nothing. No missed calls. No notifications. I checked the time. 9:42 a.m. Maybe he was busy. Maybe he forgot. Again. I shuffled to the kitchen and started my usual routine. French press half a scoop extra because I needed something strong today. The same French press Ryan had given me 4 years ago for Mother's Day, back when he still remembered holidays. Back when he used to show up for Sunday dinners and ask how I was doing without rushing to leave. While the coffee steeped, I looked out the window. The light dusting of early March snow gave everything that dull, silent glow. The city below was already alive, people hurrying to jobs, bundled up against the wind, their lives moving forward. I stood there a while, watching them, wondering when mine had started slowing down. The phone buzzed just as I sat down at the table. A text from Ryan. I felt my breath hitch. Maybe he remembered. Maybe he and Madison were on their way over. Maybe this year would be different. No. That wasn't hope. That was delusion. I opened the message. No gifts this year. We're cutting costs. But happy birthday. Hope you're doing well. I stared at it for a full minute. That was it. No call. No invitation. No mention of seeing me. Just a dry note about budgeting followed by a generic well wish. He had probably typed it while waiting in line for coffee or while scrolling through emails. I set the phone down and tried not to feel anything. But the thing about trying not to feel is it never really works. You can numb it, delay it, distract yourself with chores or memories, but it always waits, lurks behind every quiet moment. I didn't cry. That part of me had dried up years ago after the second Christmas I spent alone. I reached for my laptop, opened the browser out of habit, and clicked on Instagram. Ryan's account was still public. He never saw the point of making it private. He didn't post much, but when he did, it was always carefully curated. A picture-perfect life filtered and framed just so. The most recent post was from 8 hours ago. Paris with family. Grateful. It was a photo of Ryan, Madison, and Vivian standing in front of the Eiffel Tower. Ryan in a sleek wool coat, Madison with her perfectly tousled curls, and Vivian smiling like she owned the city in a camel-colored trench that had to cost more than my monthly rent. They were laughing. All three of them, a perfect trio under a perfect sky. I blinked slowly and stared at the screen. My hands felt cold despite the coffee I was holding. They were in Paris, on my birthday, and no one had said a word. Not a mention of it, not even a passing, "Hey Mom, we're heading out of town, let's celebrate early." Just a recycled message about cutting costs sent while boarding a plane. The caption dug in like a thorn. Family. Grateful. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. The apartment felt smaller than usual, the silence heavier. The heater kicked on with a groan and I realized I hadn't eaten anything yet. But I didn't move. It wasn't the trip. I didn't care that they went to Paris. It wasn't even the lack of a gift. I hadn't expected one in years. It was the pretending. The lie wrapped up in a pretty picture and a hashtag. Grateful. Family. Like I didn't exist. Like I had never existed. I glanced at the framed photo on the shelf by the window. Ryan, age 6, missing his 2 front teeth arms wrapped around my neck at the beach. That boy had needed me once, loved me fiercely without conditions or comparisons. That boy had clung to me in the middle of the night when the nightmares came, had kissed my cheek, and promised to buy me a big house when he grew up. Now he bought houses for other people, flew across the world for other people, texted me from another continent to say there would be no gift. I stood up and rinsed my mug, set it on the rack like I always did. My hands moved automatically, familiar, steady. But inside, something else shifted. Not rage, not grief, something quieter, final. I wasn't part of his story anymore, and maybe it was time I stopped waiting for a chapter that wasn't going to be written. I walked into the living room and sat down in my old reading chair, the one with the faded arms, and the cushion that still held the shape of my body, like a quiet memory. Outside, the snow was starting to fall again, soft and slow. The kind of snowfall that made everything look peaceful, even if it wasn't. I pulled the blanket over my lap and stared at nothing in particular, letting my mind wander somewhere I hadn't let it go in a while. It used to be just me and Ryan. After Harold left, or more accurately, after he was stationed so far away and so often that it might as well have been a divorce long before we signed anything. I did everything on my own. Doctor's appointments, parent-teacher conferences, late-night fevers, scraped knees, broken hearts. I was there for all of it. I had a chance once to move into an executive role at the hospital, HR director for the entire region. It would have meant more money, more recognition, more of everything I'd worked for. But it also meant travel longer hours, weekends on call, and I looked at Ryan, 12 years old at the time, skinny and shy with that quiet way he had of pretending he was fine when he wasn't. And I turned it down. I don't regret that choice. Not even now. I chose him. Over money, over advancement, over myself. I chose to be home. To cook dinner. To be the face he saw at every school play, every soccer match, every science fair. I was his world. And for a long time, he was mine. He was a bright kid. Always curious, always building things, asking questions I didn't always have answers to. When he got into Stanford, I cried. Not just because he made it, but because I knew what that meant. Distance. Change, the beginning of his life without me at the center. Still, he called often. Visited during breaks. Sent postcards from study abroad programs. And after he graduated and got his job at Veritech in Madison, he even flew me out once for Mother's Day. We walked the lakeside path he showed me his office, took me to dinner at a place with cloth napkins and waiters who called me ma'am. I remember thinking he's going to be fine. He'll build something beautiful. And I'll watch from the sidelines, quietly proud. Then came Madison. He met her at a marketing event, I think. Smart, confident, polished. The kind of woman who could light up a room and know it. I liked her at first. I really did. She was polite, asked about my work, said she admired how I raised Ryan alone. But there was something else. Something in the way she smiled when I answered like she already knew the script, like I was the obligatory character in a play she'd already cast. The wedding was tasteful, not extravagant, but curated. I was given a seat near the back, not with the family, but close enough to wave when the photographer passed. Madison's mother, Vivian, gave a toast that lasted nearly 10 minutes. She talked about legacy and tradition and the strength of women in her family. She never mentioned Ryan by name. I remember clapping because everyone else did. After the wedding, things shifted. Subtly at first. Ryan started missing our Sunday phone calls. The first year they spent Thanksgiving in California with the Vegas. Christmas, too. He said they had such rich traditions. Matching pajamas, a movie night, cinnamon rolls made from scratch. I used to make cinnamon rolls. Mine were from a can, but still. I didn't complain. Not out loud. I told myself they were newlyweds. That he was starting a new chapter. That it was natural to drift a little. I sent him texts. Sometimes he responded, sometimes not. The second year he forgot my birthday completely. When I called, he said he'd been planning a surprise party for Vivian's birthday and lost track of the days. I laughed. Said it was fine. Hung up and sat in the dark for an hour, watching the little red light on the answering machine blink without a message. Last Thanksgiving, I made a full dinner just in case. Turkey stuffing, cranberry sauce, even green bean casserole with the crunchy onions on top. I didn't hear from them until 2 days later when Ryan texted a photo of a beach in Monterey. Madison's family had rented a coastal house. They all looked so happy. I washed all that food down the sink, froze what I could, ate leftovers for a week, told the neighbors I had a quiet holiday and liked it that way. I kept thinking he'd notice, that Madison would listen, that one of them would remember the woman who used to sit up all night during flu season with a cold washcloth on his forehead, who clipped coupons so he could have brand-name sneakers like the other kids who never once let him feel like he was missing anything, even when we had so little. But the phone calls stopped unless I made them. The visits disappeared. Vivian became the center of everything. They went to Napa for her birthday, to Aspen for Christmas. When I mentioned wanting to see Ryan, he said they were juggling a lot. I stopped asking. Now, with the snow falling softly against the window and the warmth of the coffee fading from my hands, I understood what I hadn't wanted to admit. I wasn't part of their orbit. I was a satellite, cold and distant, floating somewhere far from their sun. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, not for warmth, but to feel the weight of something steady. Then I reached for the photo album on the side table, the one I hadn't opened in years. Inside, there were pictures of birthdays with homemade cakes, Halloween costumes I sewed by hand. Ryan in his graduation gown, smiling so wide I could almost hear him laugh. I closed the album gently and placed it back on the shelf. It wasn't bitterness. It wasn't even grief anymore. It was the quiet understanding that love, no matter how deep or how fiercely given, doesn't always come back the way you expect. The first time I met Vivian Vega was at Madison and Ryan's engagement brunch. It was held at a garden-style restaurant in Palo Alto, all string lights and artisanal omelets, the kind of place where everything looks effortless, but costs a fortune. Vivian arrived fashionably late in a cashmere wrap and oversized sunglasses, even though it was overcast. She kissed both cheeks of the hostess and glided across the patio like she owned it. She introduced herself to me with a polished smile and a compliment about my blouse, which I remember thinking was kind but calculated. Vivian had the kind of presence that took up the entire room without saying much. She was warm in that carefully controlled way all light touches on the arm and well-timed laughter. But there was something in her eyes. Something that said she had already decided who I was and where I belonged. At the table, she sat between Madison and Ryan ordering mimosas like she knew the waiter personally. When the toast came, she stood without hesitation, holding her glass high and talking about the strength of family, the power of tradition, and how proud she was to welcome Ryan into their fold. She never once mentioned me. I smiled anyway, clapped like everyone else. Over time, I began to notice how often she appeared in Ryan and Madison's life. She was at every birthday, every vacation, every celebration. Photos from Lake Tahoe, from Maui, from wine country. Always the three of them. Sometimes Madison's brother, rarely anyone else. I never saw extended family from my side in those pictures. Never saw myself. I'd get the occasional update from Ryan. We're heading to Napa for Mom V's birthday. Or we're doing Thanksgiving in Palo Alto again this year. He never said Vivian. Always Mom V. As if there were two mothers, and I had quietly been demoted. One Christmas, I sent them a hand-knit blanket I'd worked on for months. Burgundy and cream, the same colors Madison had once told me she liked. I never saw it again. In photos, they were draped in throws from designer labels sitting in a living room I'd never been invited to, beside a tree so tall it scraped the ceiling. Vivian posted it with the caption, "Holiday magic at home." I had to zoom in to notice that not a single ornament looked handmade. Not a single one reminded me of Ryan's childhood. There were other moments, smaller but sharper. I once tried to visit for Madison's birthday. Ryan had told me they were keeping it low-key, but I thought I'd drop by with flowers and a cake from her favorite bakery. When I arrived, I was told Vivian was resting and it wasn't a good time. I never even made it past the entryway. Ryan looked genuinely uncomfortable. Madison said something about rescheduling. I left the cake on the porch. Then there was the charity gala last spring. Ryan's company had donated a sizable amount and they were hosting a black tie event. I had heard through one of Ryan's former co-workers that he and Madison would be attending. I didn't expect an invitation, but I admit a part of me hoped. When I saw the pictures afterward, Vivian was there in a floor-length navy gown, standing beside Ryan and Madison as if she were the CEO's wife herself. She knew where the cameras were, always turned just slightly, always smiling, just enough. Online, Vivian was a brand. Her social media was full of humble brags, Sunday dinners made from scratch, gardening updates, inspirational quotes about family and sacrifice. Photos of Madison and Ryan with captions like "grateful for these two or family" is everything. And somehow in all that curated perfection, I simply did not exist. She was a master of presence, not loud, not cruel, just total. Everywhere she was, she filled the space in a way that left no room for anyone else, especially not me. I remember once Madison called me about a minor car accident she had near her office. I offered to come down, drive her home, help with the insurance call. She hesitated, then said Vivian was already on her way. I stayed on the line listening to Madison breathe for a moment too long before she said, "Thank you, Carolyn, but we're okay." I told her I understood. Then I hung up and stared at the silence in my living room. Over time, I stopped offering. It became clear that every need I could have filled was already covered. And maybe that would have been fine if it weren't for the way Ryan changed. He didn't just prioritize her. He forgot I was ever a priority. Vivian was always there, at the center. Not as a guest, but as the architect. The one who coordinated, who decided, who managed every gathering, every gift, every story that got told around the table. Her version of motherhood was well-lit, well-dressed, always applauded. Mine was behind the scenes, practical, quiet, overlooked. And yet I watched. I didn't speak out. I didn't ask for more. I waited for Ryan to notice, for Madison to reach out, for someone to say your mother should be here. No one did. So I started writing things down, little details, posts, comments, mentions, not with anger, not even with resentment, just a quiet collection of truths, a record. Because one day I suspected the shine would wear off. And when it did, I wanted to remember I wasn't imagining it. I hadn't disappeared. I had simply been slowly replaced. And I had let it happen. It was a Wednesday afternoon in late September when Madison called me. Her voice shaky and small. She said she wasn't feeling well, some cramping, maybe a stomach bug. She didn't want to worry Ryan since he was out of town for a conference in Denver, so she asked if I could come by and just sit with her for a bit. I didn't ask questions. I grabbed my keys and left. When I got to their apartment, she was pale and sweating, curled up on the couch with a blanket around her. It didn't take long to realize this wasn't just a bug. Her breathing was shallow, her hands trembling. She said she'd taken a pregnancy test the week before, but they hadn't told anyone yet. I helped her into the car and drove her to the nearest ER. The hours that followed were a blur of cold chairs and sterile hallways, clipped voices, and that quiet dread that comes with waiting for news you already know is bad. I held her hand while the nurse gently confirmed the miscarriage. Madison didn't cry right away. She just nodded, eyes glassy like her body hadn't caught up to her mind. They gave her a private room and I stayed overnight. I held her hair back when she was sick from the medication. I helped her change into fresh clothes. I sat by her bed when she finally broke down, sobbing into a pillow she clutched, like it might hold the pieces of what she lost. When Ryan called that night, Madison answered with a smile in her voice and said she'd caught the flu. Nothing serious, just needed rest. He told her to drink lots of fluids and get some sleep. She said she would. I stood there in the corner of the room, listening to a conversation that erased me completely. The next morning, Vivian showed up. She walked into the hospital room like she had been summoned, cool and composed in a beige trench coat and red lipstick that hadn't smudged. She kissed Madison's forehead, nodded politely at me, then pulled her daughter aside to speak in hushed tones. I stepped out of the room to give them space, but I could still hear snippets. Telling Ryan will only make him anxious. There's no point upsetting him while he's away. It's done. Let it be done quietly. When Madison came out, her face was blank. She didn't look at me as she said they'd prefer to keep it between us. Vivian turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said, "Thank you for being here, Carolyn. You've done enough." I left without arguing. I told myself it was their decision, their marriage, their grief. I told myself staying silent was respectful. I didn't want to be the meddling mother-in-law. I didn't want to cause friction. I thought I was doing the right thing. But that silence became a wall I couldn't climb back over. A week later, Ryan called me cheerful and oblivious, thanking me for checking in on Madison while he was gone. He said she was already feeling better. I said she seemed tired. He didn't notice the weight in my voice, and after that, they never spoke of it again. No mention, no acknowledgement. Madison went back to her usual smile. Vivian continued posting perfect family pictures, and I carried a memory that didn't belong to me like a stone I wasn't allowed to put down. It was around that same time that Ryan asked to borrow money. $15,000. He had a new opportunity at Veritech, a chance to buy into an employee equity program. He said it would pay off in the long run, that he just needed help with the buy-in and moving expenses. He promised to pay me back within 6 months. I wired the money the next day. No hesitation, no contract, just trust. He never brought it up again. I told myself it wasn't important, that he was busy, that it would come later, but it never did. And I never asked, because at the time I still believed that love was enough, that being a good mother meant giving without expecting anything in return. I had given my silence, my support, my savings, my presence in the middle of the night at a hospital room where I wasn't even supposed to exist. But as I sat alone at my kitchen table years later watching snow gather along the windowsill, I couldn't help but realize how many pieces of myself I had handed over without ever being asked, and how none of them had ever been returned. It was at the St. Luke's annual charity gala that I ran into Paul Nguyen. The hospital still invited me to events even after I retired, partly out of habit, partly because I'd spent 30 years there, and they knew I could still fill a table or two with donors. I hadn't planned to go that year, but something in me wanted to be surrounded by people who at least remembered who I used to be. Paul was standing by the coffee station, holding a paper cup with that same crooked smile he'd had since the day I met him. He used to consult on Medicaid fraud cases when I was working intake. We'd handled a few messy ones together, the kind that made you question where all the decency in the world had gone. We caught up quickly, swapping updates about former colleagues and new knees and creaky hips. Somewhere between refills and complaints about retirement, I mentioned Vivian Vega. Not in a bitter way, just as a name, a presence that had grown far too large in a space that used to belong to me. Paul tilted his head and said, "That name sounds familiar." "What does she do?" I told him she didn't work, that she said she was a homemaker. But I also mentioned the photos, the vacations, the designer clothes, the dinner parties in Palo Alto, how she always seemed to be in Paris or Aspen or on some vineyard in Napa, all while supposedly having no income. Paul sipped his coffee, brow furrowed. Then he said, "Leave it with me. I might take a look." I thought nothing would come of it. I didn't expect a phone call 2 weeks later. He asked if I had time to meet, said it was better in person. We sat in a quiet corner of a bakery not far from the hospital. He pulled out a folder from his coat and pushed it across the table. I opened it, expecting notes, maybe a few printed pages, but what I saw stopped me cold. Vivian Vega was being investigated by the IRS, not a routine audit, not a paperwork oversight, a full-blown investigation into fraudulent tax filings, undeclared income, and intentional misrepresentation of assets. She owned 2 rental properties in Phoenix and Tucson, both fully paid off. She had been running an online jewelry store called Vivian's Vault under a different name but linked to her personal bank accounts. She was also receiving monthly payments from her ex-husband's construction company listed as a consultant on paper, though she hadn't shown up to a meeting in years. According to IRS estimates, she was making close to $280,000 a year, quietly, privately, and claiming none of it on her taxes. Meanwhile, she had applied for bankruptcy protection, claimed she was struggling to maintain her primary residence, collected alimony, accepted financial support from Madison and Ryan, all while flaunting a lifestyle most working people couldn't dream of. Paul watched me read, didn't interrupt. When I finally looked up, he said the IRS had been watching her for over a year. What they lacked was real-time evidence, something current, public. Social media had helped, but they needed more. I sat back in my chair, the paper still trembling slightly in my hands. I wasn't shocked. That was the worst part. I wasn't even surprised. I asked him what would happen if I provided information. Photos, screenshots, dates and times. Paul said he could connect me with someone at the IRS, a woman named Dana McBride. Serious, professional, someone who could take what I had and make it matter. He warned me it might get messy. That it could affect Ryan and Madison, that anything I gave them could lead to a formal subpoena if it came to that. I nodded. I said I understood. What I didn't say was that I had already started gathering things. Vivian never thought twice about what she posted online. She believed in her own performance. Her captions dripped with curated vulnerability and designer humility. Look at this meal I made with love. Grateful for my daughter's generosity. Celebrating family with joy in my heart. I had copies of it all, albums, comments, receipts shared in family group chats. Emails Ryan had forwarded to me when Vivian's lawyer fees became urgent. I had date screenshots, even links to her product listings. Her Etsy page had glowing reviews. Her rental properties had 5-star ratings on Airbnb. She wasn't just hiding money. She was building a false identity. I left the bakery that afternoon with a different kind of clarity, the kind that doesn't come from anger or revenge. Just truth, simple and heavy. Vivian had built her world on a lie, and I was finally ready to tell the truth. The next morning, I dialed the number Paul had given me and waited while the line rang. Agent Dana McBride answered on the third ring, her voice steady, clipped, the kind that came from years of cutting through noise to get to facts. I introduced myself and told her Paul had referred me. She didn't hesitate. She asked when I could come in. Her office was in a bland federal building downtown, neutral carpet, beige walls, one potted plant by the elevator that looked like it hadn't been watered in weeks. Dana met me in the lobby with a small folder tucked under her arm. She looked younger than I'd expected, maybe late 30s, early 40s, sharp eyes behind simple glasses. We sat down in a conference room with a metal table and mismatched chairs. She opened her folder and said they'd been tracking Vivian Vega's finances for close to 18 months. The inconsistencies were significant, but what they lacked was contemporaneous evidence, something that could directly contradict Vivian's recent sworn statements. 6 weeks ago, Vivian had filed for bankruptcy protection, claiming zero income and no assets beyond her primary residence in Palo Alto. She listed her debts, painted a picture of financial hardship, and submitted everything under penalty of perjury. Dana slid a photocopy of the filing across the table. I recognized the address and her looping signature. I pulled out my own folder and opened it. I showed her the Instagram photo from Paris dated 3 days into Vivian's bankruptcy filing. The designer coat, the hotel tagged in the background. I showed her Airbnb listings for the Arizona properties still under Vivian's name, customer reviews dated just last month. I had screenshots of Etsy receipts all routed through Vivian's online storefront tied to the same email address she used on her Facebook. Dana nodded as I spoke, her pen gliding silently across her notes. When I mentioned the consulting fees, she looked up. How do you know that I told her Ryan had mentioned it once? That his father-in-law still paid Vivian monthly for, quote, family loyalty and old connections. It wasn't in writing, of course. Nothing ever was. But I had emails, forwarded to me when Ryan was asking if I thought it was reasonable to loan Vivian money for legal help. One of the emails had an attached invoice Vivian had submitted to the construction firm. Dana took it wordlessly. Then I told her what I hadn't told anyone else. Ryan and Madison were planning to give Vivian $100,000. A mix of savings, a potential loan against their home, and maybe even a GoFundMe campaign if things got desperate. The money would be used to help Vivian pay her legal team who were supposedly protecting her from unfair scrutiny. I said that if that money changed hands, they would be directly tying themselves to the fraud. Dana's voice remained calm, but something in her posture changed. She asked if I had documentation. I said not yet. But I could get it. I had never recorded my son before. It felt wrong, invasive, like a betrayal. But I also knew that what was coming wasn't about feelings anymore. It was about facts, and protecting him from a decision that could destroy everything he'd worked for. I told Dana I kept a small digital recorder in my home office. I used it for notes sometimes when I couldn't sleep and had thoughts I didn't want to lose. She didn't smile, just nodded. I walked out of that building into the cold light of late afternoon, clutching my coat tighter around my shoulders. My legs felt heavier than usual. Not from the walk, but from the weight of what I was choosing to do. At home, I sat down at my desk and opened a clean folder on my computer. I labeled it quietly, plainly. Vivi Documentation. Inside, I began dropping in files. PDFs, screenshots, emails, photos, everything dated and categorized. I added backups to a cloud drive and a password-protected thumb drive. If anything happened, I wanted there to be a trail. When Ryan called the next evening, I let the call go to voicemail. Then I called him back from the kitchen, placing the phone on speaker near the recorder. His voice was upbeat at first. He said they were just getting back from a dinner with friends. That Madison's mom was feeling anxious again. The court dates were piling up. The lawyers needed more time, more money. It was all so unfair. I asked how much they were thinking this time. He sighed. Around 100. We've got most of it, but I'm looking into a personal loan just to cover the rest. I said nothing for a moment. Then I asked if he had seen the actual court filings. Had he read what Vivian was being accused of? He said no. That wasn't his place. He trusted her. She was family. I let him talk. I let him explain. I didn't argue. I didn't warn him. I just kept the conversation going long enough to capture it all. After we hung up, I saved the file, renamed it, uploaded it to the secure folder. Then I sat down and wrote a short email to Dana. I told her I had a recording. I told her Ryan had confirmed the transfer plan. I told her I had more coming. I didn't cry. I didn't hesitate. Because it was no longer just about Vivian. It was about stopping the damage before it reached my son. I set the table carefully that Sunday evening. The good plates, cloth napkins, a simple centerpiece of white tulips from the grocery store down the street. I made Ryan's favorite dinner from when he was a boy. Honey-glazed pork tenderloin, roasted carrots, cornbread with a pat of butter melting in the center. The smells filled the apartment like a memory I wasn't sure I wanted back. He arrived just before 6, carrying a bottle of wine and that familiar, slightly hurried smile. Madison wasn't with him. He said she was at her mother's helping sort through some paperwork. I didn't ask what kind. I already knew. We sat down, and for the first few minutes it was almost easy. He complimented the food, went back for seconds, laughed at something I said about a commercial I'd seen. For a moment I saw a flicker of the boy he used to be, the one who used to drag a chair into the kitchen just to watch me cook, the one who used to say, "Someday I'm going to open a restaurant, Mom, and you'll be the boss." But the moment didn't last. Halfway through his second helping, he leaned back and exhaled. "We're moving forward with the legal support," he said. "We've decided to go all in. I sold some of my Veritech stock, and we're talking to a lender tomorrow." "How much are you giving her?" He shrugged, like it was just another bill to pay. "Around 100. It's not all at once. But the lawyers said they need a commitment up front. These federal cases move fast." I stood up and walked to the side table, opened the laptop I had set up earlier. The screen came to life with a quiet hum. I clicked the first tab, Vivian's Vault, the homepage of the online jewelry store, dozens of product listings, testimonials, a banner that read, "Handcrafted elegance with a personal touch." Ryan stared. I clicked the second tab. A digital flyer from a small consulting firm based in Redwood City. Vivian Vega listed as Senior Strategy Advisor. $15,000 a month. I clicked again. Screenshots of Airbnb listings for 2 Arizona properties. Photos of renovated interiors, booking calendars, income estimates. "What is this?" he asked. "This is what your $100,000 is protecting," I said. "This is where it's going." He looked away, rubbed the back of his neck. "That's not possible. She filed for bankruptcy. She said she was drowning." I opened the 4th tab. Vivian's signed bankruptcy filing. No assets, no income, no business holdings. Ryan stared at the screen. His fork rested in the mashed potatoes forgotten. "I've seen the documents," I said softly. "I've seen the bank transfers. I've seen the Etsy orders. I've seen everything." He didn't speak, just blinked a few times and kept staring. I watched the color drain from his face. "She's family," he whispered. "She's not perfect, but she raised Madison. She sacrificed so much." I nodded. "And she's lying to you." He shook his head slowly. "I don't know what this is. I don't know why you're showing me this. Because you were about to ruin your life for her," I said. "And I couldn't let you do that." Ryan stood, took a few steps toward the window, hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched. I waited. Let the silence stretch. Let him feel it. "You've been digging through her life," he said finally. "I've been watching the way she erases mine," I said. "And I've been trying to stop you from disappearing with me." He turned around. There was a flash of anger in his eyes, but it faded just as fast. He looked tired. Older than 39. "I thought you didn't like her," he said. "That this was personal." I walked back to the table and sat down. Maybe it was. At first, maybe I was just hurt. Left out. Maybe I wanted to believe you'd eventually see it on your own. But this, I gestured toward the screen. This isn't about who gets invited to dinner. Ryan sat back down slowly. He looked at the tabs again, then at me. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing," I said. "I don't want anything. I just want you to stop. To think. To ask yourself why someone who has this much would need your money." He didn't answer. The only sound was the ticking of the old kitchen clock marking time like it always had, even when no one was paying attention. Finally, he whispered, "I don't know what to believe." I looked at him, my son, this man I had raised and poured my life into. And I said, "I don't need you to believe me. I need you to believe the facts." And then I let it be quiet again, because sometimes the silence says more than the shouting ever could. 3 days later, my phone rang just after 6 in the morning. I was in the kitchen steeping tea when I saw Ryan's name on the screen. I picked up on the second ring, already bracing myself. "They arrested her," he said. "At her house. This morning." His voice was tight, raw. I could hear something unraveling in the space between his words. "I know I said—" There was a pause. Then he snapped. "You knew. You knew this would happen. You planned this." I didn't answer right away. I let his words hang between us, sharp and trembling. Then I said I gave the truth to the people who needed it. "That's not a plan. That's a correction." He let out a bitter laugh. "You've destroyed everything. Madison is a wreck. Her mom is in custody. Our names are being dragged into this. Do you have any idea what you've done?" I sat down at the table and folded my hands in my lap. "I stopped you from throwing away $100,000 on a criminal defense for a woman who's been lying to you for years. I stopped you from becoming a co-conspirator in federal fraud." "You destroyed our family," he said again. "No," I said. "I didn't destroy anything. Vivian did. I just turned on the light." He hung up. 10 minutes later, Madison called. Her voice was barely holding together. "Carolyn, I didn't know." She was crying. The kind of tears that don't come all at once but shake loose in waves. "I didn't know about the properties, or the business, or the money. I swear to you, I thought she was struggling. I believe you," I said. She paused like she was waiting for a lecture, a scolding something sharp to match her guilt. Instead, I opened my computer and forwarded the entire file, every document, every screenshot, every email, everything I had collected over the last few months. You deserve to see the full picture, I told her. No filters, no spin. She thanked me through tears. I could tell she didn't know whether to hate me or hug me. I didn't ask her to choose. A few days later, I heard from them again, this time through their attorney. She had advised Ryan and Madison to immediately halt any planned transfers of funds to Vivian. She told them that based on what was now on record, any financial support could be seen as aiding in an ongoing investigation. There was enough evidence to suggest Vivian had knowingly misrepresented her finances in court. Any further money could make them look like they were trying to protect or hide assets. The lawyer's email was direct. Do not move a single dollar. Do not sign anything. Do not speak publicly. Let the investigation proceed. Ryan didn't call after that. He didn't text. Nothing. But he didn't yell either. He didn't lash out. And that silence after everything felt louder than any shouting ever could. Madison sent a short message later that week. It didn't say much. We're taking some time to think. Thank you for being honest. That was all. She didn't ask for more information. She didn't offer an apology, but she didn't shut the door either. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe she was starting to understand. I didn't need them to love me for what I'd done, but I hoped in time they would see it for what it was, not sabotage, not vengeance, just a mother doing what mothers do, protecting her child, even when it hurts, especially then. 3 weeks passed without a word from Ryan. I didn't call. I didn't ask. I gave him space not out of pride, but out of understanding. The kind of understanding that comes from knowing how long it takes the truth to settle. Some truths crack you open right away. Others take time to unravel the story you told yourself to survive. It was Madison who reached out. She texted one evening asking if we could meet. Just the two of us. No explanations, no apologies. Just a quiet message and a request to come by the following afternoon. I made tea before she arrived, not knowing if she would drink it, but needing the comfort of a routine. When the knock came, I opened the door to find her standing there with a folder in one hand and something small in the other. She looked tired, not in the way people look after a long flight or a sleepless night, but the kind of tired that comes from emotional erosion, from holding something heavy for too long. We sat at the table, the same table where Ryan had once eaten cornbread with sticky fingers and laughed with his whole chest. The same table where I had shown him the truth 3 weeks ago. Madison opened the folder and slid it across to me. It's everything she said, every transaction, every Venmo note, every check, every emergency. I glanced down, itemized entries. Car repairs, medical bills, credit card payments, a down payment on a vacation rental. Vivian insisted was non-refundable. Grocery reimbursements, utility bills, a few marked simply with the word help, $45,827. She watched me as I turned the pages. I never asked, I said softly. I know, she replied. That's why I brought it. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet box, placed it in front of me without opening it. I found this in Ryan's desk last week. There was a receipt tucked inside. He bought it last year. For your birthday. I stared at the box. He never gave it to you, she continued. That was the week my mother said she needed a lawyer. Ryan sold some stock instead. He thought you'd understand. I opened the box slowly. Inside was a delicate gold chain with a heart-shaped pendant. Simple, elegant, the kind of thing I would have treasured not because of the price, but because of what it meant. A gesture, a reminder that I hadn't been entirely forgotten. I felt something shift in my chest, but I didn't let it show. Madison reached across the table, took the necklace from the box, and gently fastened it around my neck. Her hands were steady. She didn't speak. When she sat back down, I looked at her fully. Her eyes were different, softer, wiser. There was still pain there, but the kind that had started turning into clarity. He's still angry, she said. But he's quiet now. And when Ryan is quiet, he's thinking. I nodded. I know. She glanced down at the table. We went to see a financial advisor, she said. Ran the numbers. If we'd gone through with the payment to my mom's legal team, we would have wiped out our savings. Mortgaged the house. Push back retirement by 15 years. All for someone who never needed the money to begin with. She folded her hands together, thumb rubbing against thumb. I wanted to hate you for what you did, she said. I wanted to believe you acted out of spite, that you were trying to drive a wedge between us. But when I saw those bank statements, when I saw what my mother was really doing, I realized the wedge was already there. She put it there, slowly, quietly. She took a deep breath. I think part of me always knew. I just didn't want to see it. I reached across the table and placed my hand gently over hers. She didn't pull away. Everyone has their own moment, I said. When the light comes on. When you see the thing you've been trying not to see. You're not late. You're just here now. She smiled then. Just a little. But it was the first time I'd seen her smile without effort. We sat in silence for a while, letting it stretch comfortably between us. When she stood to leave, she hugged me. Not the stiff, polite kind we'd exchanged at family gatherings. This one lingered, real, heavy with everything we weren't saying. After she left, I sat at the table a long time touching the small pendant at my throat. Ryan still hadn't called, but I didn't need the call, not yet. Some truths take longer to settle, and everyone finds their way to them in their own time. The invitation came in the mail with Madison's handwriting on the envelope. It was for Ryan's cousin Emily's wedding, a Saturday evening ceremony in St. Paul, followed by a reception at a hotel ballroom overlooking the river. Madison had written a short note tucked inside. I want you there, no matter what Ryan says. I stared at the words for a long time before placing the card back in the envelope. I wasn't sure what I expected to feel. Guilt, dread, relief. But what I felt was steadiness. Like something had already been decided. On the evening of the wedding, I dressed simply. A navy blue dress I had worn once before to a retirement party. Small pearl earrings, low heels. The necklace still around my neck. I took the light rail into downtown, arrived early, and chose a seat near the back of the ceremony hall, close enough to see, but far enough to stay out of focus. The ceremony was beautiful. Emily walked down the aisle in lace and light. Her father cried. People laughed at the vows. It was the kind of gathering I used to think I'd be part of more often. But some roles disappear quietly without notice. At the reception, I found a table near the edge of the room. Not hidden, but not obvious either. I watched relatives I hadn't seen in years greet each other. I nodded when someone made eye contact, smiled when someone recognized me and waved. I drank iced tea and listened to the music. Ryan spotted me about an hour in. He had been laughing with two groomsmen near the bar when he turned and saw me sitting alone. The moment froze. His smile faded. His jaw tightened. I held his gaze. Didn't look away. He made his way over slowly. His footsteps measured his shoulders stiff. He stopped beside my chair. Not sitting. Not leaning in. I wish you hadn't come, he said low enough for only me to hear. I was invited, I replied. His eyes flicked toward Madison across the room. She was talking to Emily's mother, glancing in our direction. You ruined everything, he said. No, I said. I revealed what was already broken. He exhaled sharply like he had rehearsed the conversation but still couldn't control it. I will never forgive you, he whispered. I looked up at him, calm, unmoved. I don't need your forgiveness, Ryan. I just need you not to ruin your life over misplaced loyalty. His expression didn't change. But something in his eyes flickered. Anger. Or grief. Maybe both. From across the room, Madison looked over. Her gaze met mine steady and unflinching. She gave the slightest nod. Not dramatic, Just enough to say, I see you. I understand. As Ryan turned to walk away, someone passed by behind him. A young man, a nephew maybe, leaned in close to my shoulder as he moved past. Thank you, he said quietly, for doing the right thing. I didn't respond, just smiled gently and returned to my drink. I stayed another hour, danced once with an old cousin who insisted on spinning me in circles like we were 20 again, then gathered my things and left without saying goodbye. At home, the apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that wraps around you rather than presses down. I walked to my bedroom, removed the necklace, and placed it back in the velvet box. I didn't do it with sadness, just intention. Some things don't need to be worn every day to carry meaning. I sat on the edge of my bed feeling the steady beat of my own breath, the warmth of knowing I had done what needed to be done. Not for vindication, not for revenge, but because sometimes loving someone means stepping in front of the fire they're too blind to see coming. Sometimes love doesn't mean holding on. It means letting go before they fall. It means walking away so they can finally stand on their own. If you've ever had to protect someone in silence, if you've ever made the hard choice because it was the right one, not the easy one, share your story with us. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that honor quiet strength, difficult love, and the moments that define us. We're listening. We're here.